Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Kyle Pope, editor and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review. Thank you so much for joining us, especially at this moment in time, which is a sort of exhausting, demoralizing moment for all of us, for the country. But I think this conversation that we're having is absolutely critical. You know, what we're on this panel, all journalists, and we keenly believe in the power of journalism to hold institutions accountable, to raise voices of people who aren't otherwise heard, to focus attention on reforms that are needed, and to come up with ideas for ways that we can move forward. And local news in particular is incredibly important for that. So we think that this is an incredibly important conversation to be having. I'm thrilled to be here, and we're joined by the people who are going to lead us forward, the people who are going to help us sort of find a way forward at a time when local journalism is really under siege. I'm joined today by Emily Bell, who's the director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, by Tasneem Raja from Oaklandside, Jeanne Straus, president of Straus News, Stacy-Marie Ishmael, editorial director of the Texas Tribune, and Farai Chideya, program officer in the creativity and free expression team of the Ford Foundation. We'll talk a lot more to each of them in a minute. You should know just logistically that all of you are welcome to submit questions, to submit thoughts. We're going to get to as many of those as we can after we go through a quick overview from the panel. So let me start with Emily, my colleague at Columbia. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Kyle. Hi, everyone.
Great to see you. Emily, this is the third in a weekly series that we've been doing called the Journalism Crisis Project. Talk to us about what that is and what TAO's work around this is and what we're hoping to accomplish.
Thanks, Kyle. So the Journalism in Crisis project started, as many great journalism research projects do, as a spreadsheet, which is really just an attempt at this moment in time to capture everything that is happening in newsrooms. We're starting with the United States, and we're adding regions around the world as we go, really over the course of the next year. So it started off as a counting exercise, but obviously you can't capture the things that are really going on in newsrooms just with raw data. You know, we thought that, and I remember, Carl, you and I had this conversation about, this is going to be a story that completely dominates our lives as journalists and researchers and educators. And we, first of all, need to know what's going on. So I would urge everybody who knows about changes in your newsroom. It's not just about jobs losses and furloughs, but it's also about other ways in which your newsroom is changing, and let us know about it. So we know that we need to know what's actually happening at this moment, what's lost. But I'm so thrilled that we have the people that we have today, because it's exhausting and depressing to see the tens of thousands of jobs that are going. And really, sort of, I think part of this project is also shining a light on what are the things that we need, what do we need to advocate for, how can we rebuild, how can we transition old models into new models, and how can we make new models sustainable and better. I think that a lot of what we'll talk about today is just, you know, we've reflected a lot on the failure, not just the business failure, but other failures in journalism, and having new ideas, new momentum, and ideas for rebuilding are as important now as they have, more important now than they've ever been.
Thank you. Again, as we go along, put your thoughts in the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Let me start with Tasneem Raja from Oaklandside. Oaklandside, for those of you who don't know, it's a local news outlet in the Bay Area that launched in March, and it is really intended to sort of fill a void there. Tasneem is the former executive editor and co-founder of the Tyler Loop, a nationally recognized nonprofit local news startup in East Texas. Again, proud to have another Texan, or somebody at least with Texas roots, in this group. Tasneem, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you for coming. So tell us a little bit about what motivated the founding of Oaklandside, and what's been the experience of the last few weeks?
Sure, absolutely. So our origin story, I think, is a really powerful one. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Berkeleyside, and also, I hope, with the Tyler Loop. The co-founders of Berkeleyside, which launched in Berkeley, California 10 years ago, and I came together in the summer of 2019 to create Cityside, which is now a nonprofit organization that powers both Berkeleyside and the Oaklandside. And the thinking behind our Oakland project was, it really doesn't even need to be spelled out, right? How can a city with the size, complexity, diversity, importance, history of Oakland not have a dedicated, independent news outlet wholly devoted to serving and covering the city? So Berkeleyside had, successfully established a model of sustainable, digital-first, hyper-local news startup. My experience in Tyler really building from the ground up on a foundation of listening, on a foundation of community-centered, community-powered journalism. We felt that there was this incredible moment in which we could start asking questions of Oaklanders about their news needs, about their information needs. We actually don't use the word news very often. We really talk more in terms of information, to then build over many months a set of founding values, a set of how exactly we're going to shape our reporting agenda, how exactly we're going to build this team to be responsive to what we're hearing from Oaklanders. Our initial plan was to launch in late June of this year. And then, of course, in March, way ahead of our schedules, the coronavirus pandemic hit. And we felt it was our duty to mobilize sooner. This is where actually I think the power of this network that we have created under Cityside with Berkeleyside and now the Oaklandside really started to show its promise, because we said, we've got a platform. Let's start reporting at Berkeleyside while our own platform continues to be built. And so by that point, we had assembled, we are a small team, but an even smaller team. At that point, it was really just myself and 2 editors. And we continued hiring and then just hit the ground running and started reporting on the impacts of the coronavirus on our city. And then, of course, 2 weeks ago, we pivoted again and started covering the impacts and the questions and the nuanced perspectives and history that we need to bring to the coverage of this moment. And we are continuing still to report through Berkeleyside. We did launch our own Twitter feed on Monday. I think we got like 4,000 Twitter followers over the course of 3 days, but we need to do a lot more. Most of our audience is not going to be on Twitter. And we are aiming to launch our own standalone platform on June 15th.
I'm really curious about your view on what the stories that you were telling that you're not seeing in other outlets that are in the greater Bay Area. I mean, I think one of the notions that has sort of taken hold around this whole collapse of local news thing is that it's been sort of like an act of nature, or that local news outlets had no role in losing parts of their audience. It's a controversial idea for a conversation like this, but I think it needs to be talked about. Can you talk about like what the void is that you're seeing from other outlets that are trying to cover, let's say the last 2 weeks?
Yeah, I don't tend to start there. I tend to start with with the position of how can we strengthen the entire local information ecosystem. There are lots of people doing really great work out here. I would say that it is more a question of how are we going to be additive in this moment? How are we going to respectfully collaborate with the folks who are already doing really great work on the ground, many of whom are not with mainstream traditional media outlets, and how are we going to play a role in not just doing great work ourselves, but actually building up the entire journalism capacity of this community. So I would just say, I know that's not really an answer to your question, but it's just not how I tend to think about it.
Fair enough. Do you have any thoughts though on the additive part of it? Like where can you guys add specifically to the conversations that are going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one example I'm happy to share is we are partnering with El Timpano. El Timpano, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, is a phenomenal project that's been, that was launched about 3 years ago here in Oakland, led by Madeline Baer. El Timpano is a journalism platform that specifically serves monolingual Spanish-speaking Latino residents of Oakland and beyond. And over the past several years, they've they've built an incredible network of relationships with community members who we, just launching fresh on day one. I mean, we would have to put in so much work to get there and reach just a fraction, I think, of the audience that El Timpano has already built. We need to partner with them, and we hope that they will also benefit in partnering with us, where we can provide reporting resources, information resources that they don't have. They can work with us to help surface questions, voices, perspectives, story ideas from their community, and also have a two-way dialogue back where our reporting then flows to the community members that they have already built trusted relationships with. And I think that's just one example of how it's going to take partnerships and collaborations for us to be able to truly serve our mission.
Tasneem, thanks a lot. I'll come back to you. Jeanne Straus is the president of Straus News, which publishes 17 local newspapers in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. She is a former boss of mine, much loved figure in New York journalism.
We miss you.
Jeanne,
we miss you.
Jeanne, so good to see you. Jeanne comes to us from a whole different perspective, not a digital startup, a family-run, local, largely print newspaper business. Tell us what the last few months have looked like to you, and sort of how you think about a chain like yours in this broader conversation.
Well, let me just start by saying thank you so much, Kyle. We do miss you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of it today, and Emily as well. Thank you so much. I just want to jump off what Tasneem said. This has been a time of incredible collaboration for us. So we partner with people we previously would have considered to be our competitors, to make sure that we're covering the widest range of local news in a bunch of our communities. So our weekly competitors in Manhattan, Kyle, AM New York, Metro New York, we're all working together to make sure that our audiences have the most local, most up-to-date information. It's been, so that's one of the silver linings to this incredibly difficult time. It's been a very tough time. We cut back staff, mostly production staff. The papers are obviously a lot smaller because advertising has fallen about 50%, which is huge for us.
Since COVID.
Since COVID, yeah, since the third week of March. And, but it hasn't gone down to zero. And our people are doing incredible things. I think our businesses are counting on us more than ever. They're too busy trying to restart their businesses or figuring out how to do takeout or whatever to worry about marketing. So if we go to them with ideas about how we can help connect them to our audience, they're like, yeah, let's do that, let's do that. It's also been really stressful for our staff, but really energizing. To be so critical, to be so needed. We have huge engagement with our print products and with our digital products, obviously, way up over the past. And people have expressed their appreciation in ways that maybe in better times, people would take us for granted. So that's the flip side, the good news in all of these difficult times. It's been an exciting and important time to be in the business.
Have you, what models or what structure or what funding ideas have you heard? I mean, I began the whole thing by talking about this, the local news around the country has taken such a big hit. And there have been a lot of us that have been talking about this now for a couple of years or more, and you've certainly been engaged in a lot of these discussions. Has there been anything that sort of bubbled up to you, even in the last few months? It's like maybe that is going to be the thing that could really help move the needle.
So a couple of things. First of all, I thought in your first seminar, some of the remarks that Penny Abernathy made were really, really insightful. The distinction between the loss of journalists at the big papers, the big regional groups, and the loss of sort of newspapers at the hyper-local level. I actually think the more hyper-local, independently owned businesses around the country, newspapers, have weathered pretty darn well and have managed to hold up. They're very close to their communities. They're viewed as being essential. I think over the long haul, the answer is, I think it's a mixed metaphor, but like four-legged stool. It's going to require businesses and communities that have enough of a business support a main street still to support the newspaper with advertising. It's going to be required that individuals are involved either in a subscription or membership or whatever you want to call it, paywall. I view that's all individuals helping support the effort. And then I think local foundations are going to have to step up as well, and philanthropy. I mean, it's going to be those four things that are going to take it to support a robust community, either digital or print news products.
Thanks. All of that is worth like us coming back to all of those ideas. In fact, it transitions well to Stacy-Marie Ishmael, who's with us next. She's the editorial director of the Texas Tribune. Hello. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Happy to be here as much as one can be.
Right. Well, tell us how has the Texas Tribune thought about its coverage over the last couple of weeks?
Deeply and extensively. I think one of the key things, just for context for folks on the panel, I joined the Texas Tribune as the editorial director roughly a day and a half before the city of Austin shut down for coronavirus. And so we have been navigating through this as an entirely distributed newsroom, which has been it's presented its own set of challenges, but it's also made us, I think, much more empathetic to the realities of what different folks are going through, for example, with online education, or how, folks at UT, students or teachers, are kind of like responding to this crisis. And so I think that this is one of those rare examples when journalists, who are very often removed from the reality of what is going on, have been unable to separate themselves from the story. And it's given a degree of empathy and understanding, which I find to be both important and very helpful. And it's something that I don't want us to lose. One of the first things that we noticed in March, like probably every other media organization around the world, was that the number of people coming to us for news was, one, off the charts, and two, registering very different behavior from things we'd seen before, right? So we went from having X number of visitors mostly coming to us on mobile at certain times of the day to just like tremendous numbers of people hitting the homepage directly across all platforms, people subscribing to newsletters, people reading individual stories, people finding us through search. And we made a series of decisions as a news organization across the newsroom and our product and engineering teams to make sure that we were making it as easy as possible for these audiences, new and existing, to find exactly what kinds of news reporting, analysis, statistics, data they were looking for. And that meant, making some tough decisions about, okay, we are in an election year. There is a tremendous amount of news in Texas around mail-in voting, for example. It was about to be hurricane season. How are we going to manage all of these priorities? And it's a conversation that I'm really glad we were able to have. Shout out to my Chief Product Officer, Millie, who is currently doing her job from Queens, because we weren't able to get her on a plane before New York went into lockdown, for being a real partner in helping us prioritize and triage. And I think for me, that's a really important thing that I want to emphasize, not just for local newsrooms, but for all newsrooms. Like, you have to be in partnership with your business teams and your product teams and your advertising teams, to your point, Jeannie, about like, this is what we are doing, this is why we are doing it, and these are the decisions that we're going to have to make across the org to make sure that we are joined up in getting there.
One of the the areas I think you have a lot of insight in is the events business, which is huge for Texas Tribune, and an important part of your branding, an important part of how people experience the brand. That business, at least for now, is at your place and everywhere, is sort of on hold.
The physical events business is on hold.
Right.
Our
so
virtual events business is real busy.
Really? Tell us about that.
Again, because we made decisions early, like we went to mandatory work from home before any of the shelter in place or stay at home orders in Texas, just out of one, an abundance of caution and professional paranoia, but two, there had been right around this time various journalists at a specific conference who there were concerns that folks had been exposed to coronavirus, and we just made the call like, look, we are seeing community spread. We are going to take steps to keep our folks safe as quickly as we possibly can. And that also meant reckoning with the fact that we would not have access to our studio, which is kind of a key part of our events infrastructure and something we're very fortunate to have. But we still want to be helping people access information in the ways that they are looking for, and hearing from an epidemiologist or a public health official or your state rep or your judge is something that is really important to our audiences here. And so we in March quickly had to figure out, and you can tell from the first ones that we did that we were figuring it out. We quickly had to figure out how it was we were going to be able to put these events on in a way that wasn't kind of like a webinar for the sake of it, but something that was appropriate for the format, had a range of perspectives and insights and really answered an audience need. And that helpfully was also something that our incredibly hardworking sponsorship team would be able to use as an opportunity for monetization. Like, we have not been affected by the decline in programmatic advertising because we are generally like a handheld shop. But we are still seeing softness in the market around sponsorship opportunities that would have been kind of like an easy conversation a couple of months ago. So we are very alive to making sure that we are looking at ways to continue to provide excellent and useful journalism to our audiences, and that we are continuing to find ways to fund that excellent and useful journalism in, as sustainably as we can.
Thanks a lot. This is a perfect transition to talk about funding and funders and philanthropy. Farai Chideya, as I mentioned, is a program officer in the creativity and free expression team at Ford. She's been a supporter of CJR, I'm happy to say. Farai, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to see you.
You too. How have has your thinking about the fund, the business structure of local news, or the need for different local news voices, has it changed as a result of COVID and the police violence and protests that have followed? Are you thinking about it differently, or do you take a much longer view than that?
Definitely not thinking about it differently, but seeing it as an acceleration. So Ford has really worked to optimize our journalism portfolio for media equity, which is the idea that everyone should have access to high quality news, including local news, and that people of every race and class and ethnicity and physical ability or disability should be newsroom leaders, managers, owners, operators, etc. So we had already really been working towards that. And because, Ford gives away about $10 million a year in journalism funds, but compared to a largely for-profit media industry, any single foundation can only make so much impact. But I think one thing that we've looked for is organizations that are modeling behavior and leadership, as well as doing excellent work. So Documented, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with them, a New York local and regional immigration investigative reporting outfit. has really taken a lot of leadership in using service journalism technology, developing SMS text messaging responsive systems so people who are day laborers can get information. And it's a very different way. I think there's become this kind of intellectual purism in journalism, which actually isn't how it started. Journalism was viewed as very practical. And now we're like, oh, anything practical is pandering. It's like, no, people need practical information. So I think we look at innovative leadership like theirs. We look at City Bureau with their Documenters project, where they're basically paying citizens to train as citizen journalists to record town hall meetings. I think
this is in Chicago, right?
Yeah, they're based in Chicago, but they're spreading it as a kind of franchise model. And I think that the architecture of journalism is changing. There is journalism, which is a product, either in the commercial or nonprofit world, and then there's journalism as a function of civil society. So something like City Bureau's work with citizen journalists is journalism as a function. It doesn't matter that the people who are doing the journalism are not journalists, air quote. They are doing journalism. So it is a civic function that citizens who are not full-time journalists can perform. And I think increasingly we need to realize that we need both. We need very, wonderful established organizations that can give us synthesis, analysis, breadth of reporting, and we also need journalism as a function. And so something else I would point out is that we're not funding her, or at least not yet, but Heather Chaplin at the New School, her J&D Lab, Journalism and Design. She's talked about using community colleges as part of the key news information architecture. That's the kind of thing we need to think about. Like, the old system is over. Doesn't mean that all of the old outlets are over. Anyone can evolve and change and be nimble. And I think, I was extremely excited when Stacy-Marie went to the Texas Tribune, because given her work history, her background in technology, her keen understanding of race and class and national origin, she's the kind of leader we need to see in newsrooms today. So I'm all for the highly skilled, very top of the line newsroom. Just need to rethink information architecture for an era where a lot of places are not going to have a newspaper again, ever.
Thank you, Farai. Emily, let me come back to you before we open it up to questions. And by the way, we have a lot of questions already coming in. Please keep adding them and we'll get to them, as many of them as we can. We haven't talked at all about the role, if any, of the platforms in the solution to some of what we're talking about, or at least an idea of how to move things forward. And it relates to this, what Farai was just talking about the different sort of structural ways of thinking about this. What are you seeing? What is your level of optimism that they could offer something that will be helpful?
Well, I think that's a great question. I was actually going to put my hand up and ask a question to Tasneem on exactly this, which is because Facebook and the Google Digital News Initiative are part of the reason that Berkeley side was able to expand. We've been researching this relationship a lot. I have reservations about it because I think particularly when you're in places like Northern California, where a lot of the civic infrastructure, a lot of the demographics are directly impacted by the presence of very large corporations. The traditional sort of journalistic whole power to account part of me thinks, if we're rebuilding, and I've heard from everybody, and I really want to go back and hear more from the panelists on this, partnerships, networks, sort of kind of interoperability between different parts of civic society. I thought what Farai said was absolutely spot on about, this is a civic function. You have technology companies who, first of all, are throwing a lifeline when no other exists. So let's just acknowledge that actually they are putting money in at the moment. I think that the problem with that is that there's no sort of security in that. We see that they are very much led by priorities which are non-journalistic at a corporate level. I think that there are some issues around conflict of interest, but I think when we're refiguring what these partnerships look like and how we can build this infrastructure, there is a big question, which is, should those organizations be sort of directing the conversation, which to some extent they are at the moment? Or should we be, you know, finding ways to take their money, but also sort of keep them at arm's length? So I don't know whether kind of Tasneem wants to tackle that one. It's a little bit unfair asking you directly about your own funders, but it must be a question.
I'm happy to also
up.
answer that question.
Great. Okay, that's good. Either.
Tasneem, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Stacy-Marie.
So, you know, for the past 3 years, I working out of East Texas, you know, working essentially by myself, no money, no salary, no support, churning out, you know, working with mostly non-journalists on the ground and training people in journalistic methods and storytelling methods to cover segregations, school segregation, healthcare access, mental health care access, you know, what the future of this deeply diverse but deeply segregated city looks like in the regional hub of, you know, one of the biggest swaths of one of the most complicated and important states in the country. And I was just doing this entirely on my own, no support, no funding, to really keep us going. And it was incredible what we were able to achieve in that time, you know, and also I think the national attention that we were getting on our work. But at the end of the day, it's not sustainable. I couldn't keep going that way. I'm happy to say that the Tyler Loop does continue. I'm now on the board. We have a new executive director, but you know, it will always be okay, we can do another year. Can we do one more? Maybe we get to a point where we just can't keep going. So I saw what I was able to achieve with no resources. And, you know, I came to East Texas after having been at NPR, having been at Mother Jones, and, you know, certainly at NPR in a situation where we had a lot of resources, but operating within, you know, a much larger organization where it's very hard in a large organization to be really nimble and truly responsive to on the ground communities, you know, especially working out of the NPR headquarters in DC. We're just not really always built to do that in a way that local newsrooms are. So this opportunity felt like a way of kind of bringing it all together to say, okay, we built this, I believe, astonishingly powerful reporting unit in East Texas, fueled by, you know, fumes. And we have an opportunity now to start with the kind of initial seed funding that we have seen some of the successful statewide and national nonprofit digital first startups launch with, that get, you know, praised left and right and held up as models for, hey, this is what everybody should be doing, right? We've seen sustainability here. What's it going to take now to bring this down to the local level? Well, what it's going to take is investment. What it's going to take is money to hire staff, to hire editors, to hire reporters and audience directors and product directors and technologists to be truly responsive to the needs of our communities. So what have we done so far, right? I'm looking back at our coverage as we're talking over the past week, and I'm seeing we did, you know, with our team of reporters, we're now 7. We are a majority people of, we are a team that is majority journalists of color, majority folks who've been in Oakland. And we have been reporting, for instance, on, you know, just yesterday, one of our reporters called nearly 40 pharmacies across the city to say, are you open? Are you operating right now or not? Because we know that Oakland just lost access to a slew of pharmacies in the middle of a viral pandemic. I'm looking at our history of curfews. We did this deep dive into the history and wider context of how curfews have long been used to quell pain and fury in communities of color in response to moments just like this. This is the kind of work you just can't do in a sustained fashion without investment. So the question of who's investing, who's stepping up to support, yes, that's absolutely a conversation that needs to be had. But I hope that we'll also trust the journalists who step up to lead and join these kinds of operations to say, we are coming in with a lot of deeply thoughtful, deeply intentional conversation about what it means to be funded by the Google News Initiative and to be funded by the American Journalism Project. We're not just saying, okay, sure. I guess we'll take your money and, you know, we'll figure it out. We're having a lot of conversation about this. We're talking to our communities about this. We are creating internal processes that we will be making public to say, what does editorial independence, what does editorial integrity look like in this moment? And we're also doing the work that the response from our community has been overwhelming to say, you are filling a void. So I would say, please, let's have this conversation about who is stepping up to invest. But please, let's also acknowledge that the work needs to be done. The communities are asking for this work to be done. And I hope that we can push and encourage you know, a wide variety and a wide spectrum of types of initial seed funders to step up, step to the plate, get involved. Don't just give us the, you know, don't just give us these grants that are really not going to enable us to be transformative. Give us money to hire a real team of journalists and get to work, because otherwise, you know, I've seen what happens to so many of these operations. I've seen what happened when I was trying to get the Tyler Loop going and to be sustainable. It's just, you're always just grasping for tomorrow, and you can't dream, you can't think big.
I wanted to get sort of, oh, sorry, Kyle, I wanted to sort of come to Stacy-Marie on that question as well, who said, I can answer it. But I just thought you touched on something so important there, Tasneem, which is something we've been looking at in our research as well, which is just the disclosure of these relationships and how they thought about in newsrooms and are people thoughtful about them, is something which I feel that most of the practice hasn't quite got to yet. But that exactly that sort of thinking and leadership, I think, will hopefully get us there. So I don't know, Stacy-Marie, you had something to say about platforms.
All funders are potential sources of conflict. All funders, right? And it is right and appropriate to note that technology companies have a disproportionate effect on media and distribution and audiences, and that we are often in a deep struggle to survive in the advertising industry because of decisions that have been made and enabled by technology platforms. It is also true that they are, in varying ways, at different degrees of millions and thousands, stepping up to donate to enable this work to happen. Like, we have personally been very fortunate beneficiaries of a significant grant from Facebook that has made it possible to, you know, create our Revenue Lab, or Rev Lab, with the goal of helping other media organizations, particularly nonprofits and local media organizations, learn and understand, hey, here's what we've tried that has worked for us, and here's what we've tried that has not worked for us. Here's how this may be applicable to you. At the same time, as someone who has also worked at a technology company, I am like on the record as saying the most meaningful things that tech companies can do for journalism is make product changes, right? Like, you would have to be getting into the hundreds of millions of dollars in donations for the kinds of effects that they could have if they were to change what are relatively minor in the grand scheme of road mapping, some of the decisions that inform how they think about their products, who they let our stories get in front of, the audiences that they introduce to us, the kinds of access to what we would consider to be first-party data that they do not consider to be first-party data. And that's absolutely where I think the conversation needs to continue in terms of how tech companies can show up as it relates to journalism.
I think that's I think that's a great point. And I think, you know, Google announced a round of giving out $5,000 grants. I'm speechless. I'm speechless to support local journalism when a tiny little change could really change the local news industry in their programmatic ads. For example, if they weren't allowed to, you know, be holding all of our data about all of our readers, and if cigarette advertising was once upon a time legal. If programmatic advertising was not legal, it would all be a completely different game.
Jeanne, I want to come back to you in a second, because there's been a few questions from people in the audience about your comment about how you're cooperating with former competitors. But before we get off of this point about funders and the ties and the tensions, I feel like I would really like to hear from Farai on this. I mean, my assumption is that the future path of local news is going to have to include more philanthropic funding and more foundation funding. What are you seeing? And I mean, the description that Tasneem used to the sort of rigor and the transparency of how they think about these tensions is interesting to me. Are you seeing other people doing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that I do believe that philanthropic investment in news is very important, but I still think that in the end, news and information will be a for-profit driven industry. You know, so I've worked at CNN, ABC, MTV News, Oxygen, all these for-profit companies, plus in public radio. And I was at ABC when it was bought by Disney, and someone explained a simple piece of math to me, which was, oh, well, the entertainment unit yields about 25% in revenue, and the news unit yields about 7%. So we're being asked to level up to the entertainment yield. And so that is pretty much ridiculous in terms of, you know, that's not the economics of news. And I'm not delusional about what for-profit news is and isn't, but I also think that philanthropy can't save the news. We have to begin to think of philanthropy as a lever for incentivizing new models and information systems that then ripple across the industry. And that's really one way that we've looked at the portfolio, and also with a research focus. So we have a landscape analysis coming out at the end of the month at Ford, looking at innovation in the service of media equity. I will say with 100% personal certainty, and your mileage may vary, that if we had heeded the Kerner Commission report 52 years ago, the news media would be different. It would be integrated. We'd have some sense of class, and we would never have boxed ourselves into the corner that we have now, where during the last election cycle in 2016, Les Moonves, who's now disgraced, but at the time was a big man, said that Trump is not good for America, but he's good for CBS. And he said some version of that in 2 different earnings calls. And it was reported and leaked, and still somehow he was viewed as fit to run that news division. I mean, obviously he wasn't just over the news division, but so I am not, again, without reservations about the challenges of for-profit news, but I think the problem among many has been that philanthropy has been asked to save an industry that it doesn't control. You know, it's like, you know, a toddler being asked to supervise their parents. I hate to say it that way, but like we need to do what we can do in the nonprofit media world, which is to innovate, show new pathways, produce excellence, and serve the public. But we can't rescue the journalism industry. So I just thought I'd lay that out there. I don't know if that's where we were going.
Thank you. I'm going to try now to get to as many of these questions as I can. Jeanne, somebody asked you if you could spell out in a little more detail the way that you're cooperating with former competitors and how that's working.
It's working well. It's not as robust as we would have hoped, but we've agreed that during the shutdown, for example, that we weren't going to send 2 reporters to the governor's press conference or the mayor's press conference every day. We were going to send 1 reporter and send the other person's reporter to do something else, to do some other reporting. I mean, those kinds of common things where, you know, do we really need 10 people sitting there at the governor's press conference, which is being broadcast live? And is that a good use of our reporting abilities at any individual time? So that kind of thing. And picking up each other's stories, you know?
Yeah.
Somebody asked how local journalists can better plan to address meeting citizen needs regarding the converging crises of COVID and the general election disinformation, whether there are resources that can be shared. Regarding the election in particular, has anybody seen interesting, I know there's Election Land, which is a
joint project
which is
Newmark, ProPublica, and others.
Right.
Yep.
Other than that, has anybody else seen any interesting models around election coverage or just disinformation coverage?
A few things. One of the most effective things that newsrooms can do is flood the zone with legit information, because disinformation and misinformation absolutely thrive in a vacuum. And when we are vague, when we are non-specific, when we write headlines that do not contextualize, comments that are themselves misleading, we are in fact contributing to the problems of misinformation and disinformation in our own reporting or failure to report. And so, making sure that we are 100% on top of this is what's actually happening and this is how you can find out in your particular communities is essential. I think the other thing that we generally as an industry is really bad at is we are generally quite monolingual. Right, I want to shout out to the Center for Community Media at Newmark J, which is one of the only places that is currently organizing and resourcing and helping the variety of community newspapers, and they are largely newspapers, though there are some online as well, that publish in languages other than English. And just at the Texas Tribune, one of our reporters published a story a couple of days ago around the fact that so much of the really essential coronavirus and public health information is not being actively translated, even in a state like Texas. And this is also true for California, Arizona, and others. And so understanding that where we can make our stories available and accessible, even if that means thinking through who we can partner with, who may be able to translate these resources, how we might, if we have if we have an audience in a place that doesn't have broadband, but they have a lot of access to broadcast, right? Like, how can we get our stories in front of those kinds of audiences? Can we put our reporters on TV more? Like, can we get our reporters on radio? How can we, whether it's the example that you shared earlier of using text messaging. I think understanding that it's not only about combating the false information, it's about providing things that are accurate and making sure that the people who would most benefit from seeing that can.
Yeah, and if I could, I'd like to add to that. I think that is just so spot on. And it's, how we show up for our communities in our coverage of the impacts of the coronavirus crisis on our community is going to affect how they see us and how much they're going to tune in when we show up in this moment that we're in right now. And all of that is going to have knock-on effects. As the months go by, if we didn't show up properly for coronavirus, if we didn't show up properly for uprisings against police brutality, they're not going to tune in and they're not going to trust us. They're not going to help us flood the zone with real information by sharing our work and getting involved in our work when it comes to elections. So I think we cannot look at these story cycles in a vacuum, and we cannot look at them in isolation. We have to understand that each of these has an audience building role, where if you mess up your context, your frame, your narrative, once, so many people have been saying it recently. I think maybe Stacy-Marie, you may have even tweeted this, the time it takes to build trust compared to the fraction of an instant in which it takes time to lose that trust, and then you spend forever rebuilding it. We've just been so, as I said, we didn't expect to start reporting until late June. We've been reporting since March because we knew if we don't show up during this crisis, why are they going to tune in? Why are people going to tune in when we do finally show up and start reporting on the election?
Yeah,
Emily, I'm sorry, go ahead, Farai.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but Stacy-Marie put something on Twitter that I retweeted, basically about how the expertise of Black reporters is often dismissed, because it's like, well, of course you think that. And that there's this endless cycle of basically, if you're a Black reporter, you are Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill to try to reach the mountain of truth. And then it kind of rolls back on you. And then 6 months later, someone was like, wow, that was a pretty heavy boulder. We have to get better as an industry. We have been stuck on stupid with these false notions of objectivity. And I believe in fairness. So I did a training yesterday for a major newsroom around how to cover this era. And there were 200 people on, which I didn't know until I started getting emails from people. But basically, I talked about how when I interview white supremacists, which I have many different times in person and remotely, I am not objective about white supremacy as an ideology, but I am fair. I do not depict them to be different than they are. I am a reporter, and I'm there to understand them and depict them fairly. What has happened in America is that we have seemed to think that everyone who is in some ways non-normative to I'm just going to be frank, and I don't care if I sound like an SJW or whatever. Cisgender, white, upper middle class male. That is the normative journalist in terms of who gets authority in the newsroom. And I have found it incredibly frustrating to just do my job. And so right now, what I'm seeing across Black Twitter, white Twitter, articles like the one that Stacy-Marie was just in Glamour talking to Black reporters, is this wave of like, why didn't you believe us when you had the chance? And I think that if nonprofit journalism can do something, it is, again, in modeling best practices and behaviors. And funders have to be aware that where our money goes matters. And that if we are not supporting organizations that do equitable hiring and feature content that really discusses America as it is, we've lost the game. So I do think, you know, this landscape analysis that Ford has coming out really talks about the whole infrastructure of how you create innovation, and also where for-profit funding comes in, because I think part of what has to happen is that hopefully some for-profit journalism organizations will begin to look at the successes of innovative nonprofits and say, how can we gather some best practices? But I just think overall, covering this era requires a bit of reflection and humility on the part of the entire journalism profession, that we did not reform ourselves after the Kerner Commission report, which said we had to, and we didn't, and now we're here. So what are we doing for 50 years from now?
I just wanted very quickly just to relate what Farai said to what Tasneem and Stacy-Marie said, which is we've had, since 2016, we've had this sort of obsession, fetishization of disinformation and misinformation. And there's nothing wrong with that, but what we're seeing is a lot of funding going into playing what I would call whack-a-mole, and almost no funding going into exactly the things that everybody on this panel has been talking about, which is how do you look at the whole picture, and how do you start with newsroom reform, and how do you actually fund that in a sustainable way? And I know there's lots of sort of great work that fact-checking organizations do, and I think that, you know, we should have more fact-checking organizations, but we're seeing a binary at the moment which says we have to fight misinformation. I really want people to make the case that says really, really excellent journalism fights misinformation, and we have to know what that excellence looks like, and we have to fund it, because at the moment we fund a lot of disinformation projects, but to me we're sort of missing a piece of this, which is, you know, what's really effective. And exactly as Tasneem, Stacy-Marie and Farai say, it's having better newsrooms, understanding their communities, and being all over the issues.
It's having
that they want
better
to know about.
newsrooms. You can't fight disinformation if you have no reporters, right? If you are a news organization in Cleveland and your reporting desk has gone to zero, like, you're doomed. But you could have 100 phenomenal reporters and no trust. And I think the other piece of this, to Farai's point and to Tasneem's, is we have also not necessarily done the work to show people why they should trust us. Which is not about, like, journalists are great. It's like, you don't have to care about individual journalists being great. You have to believe that what you are seeing reflects what you are seeing. And when there is a constant disconnect between those two things, it's very hard to convince someone that you know what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, I love the way you put it, and this will stick in my head for sure. It's the best way to combat disinformation is flooding the zone with good information. And, you know, I think when we talk about what we do as news, as reactive, as, you know, we've got to follow the story, I think we're missing opportunities to say, how are we driving the conversation? How are we anticipating people's hopes and fears and dreams and concerns, and asking the questions of you know, and being really intentional about who we're asking, whose input are we getting, whose questions are we capturing? to show up for people in a way where it's not just that I think sometimes in the disinformation conversation, we're still just reacting, right? We're still chasing something that somebody else is doing, trying to catch up and say, no, we're here too. Let's get ahead of it. Let's drive the conversation. Let's be the place where we're answering people's questions, you know, like even getting ahead and saying, where do we know people are going to be tomorrow? How can we start doing that work today? And one of the best ways to get there is to have, you know, create spaces where readers can truly drive your coverage in an intentional, thoughtful, and mutually beneficial way.
We promised people we would take an hour here, and it's 3 minutes to 1. With the if the panel wouldn't mind just going just a few minutes over, because I want to just get to a couple more questions before we wrap up.
Sure.
One of the is everybody okay with that? One of the questions I wanted to get to on here goes back to the philanthropy idea. It's from Carol Bogert. Hello, Carol. Who notes that there seems to be some national philanthropy for local news, but much less local philanthropy. Why is that? And has anybody seen any signs of that changing?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that there is increasing interest of local funders. The reality is that most community-based foundations don't have a specific journalism program officer and often are intimidated by the complex matrix of choices in front of them for what they fund. Like, you know, do you try to work with the local, you know, small paper, the big paper, you know, there's, you know, I won't get into all the different things, but for example, there was a big wave, well, at least to me, a big wave of funding for-profit newsrooms to basically cover specific topics. And what happened, which I think was pretty predictable, was that those newsrooms covered them as long as there was money.
There was funding.
You know, and that's not even necessarily bad math, but there was this assumption like, oh, if we seed it, they'll run with it. It's like, not necessarily. And so I think that there's a different issue around local funders, which is like people say, where do I place my bets? And I think that there is a role for, there's certainly groups like media impact funders, but there's a role for entities, intermediaries, advisors who speak to community foundations about what their stake is. First of all, are they looking for primary impact? Meaning, are they looking for impact on the field of journalism? Or are they looking for secondary impact on local housing policy or taxation, et cetera? Those are two very different ways of funding. So I think that there's an increasing amount of people on this learning curve of how you do local investments in news. And I think it's actually exciting.
I actually think that, I think it was Pew that did a study recently that showed how few people know that their local for-profit journalistic enterprise is under financial pressure.
Yep.
And that the reason there have been so few local foundations, local philanthropy, is because we haven't made a good case for the fact that the community needs us to survive and that we're under pressure. So I think it's the onus is largely on us, having not gone specifically to them to tell our story.
Anybody else have any thoughts on local funding? You know, before let's go around, and I'm gonna let everybody answer this final question. I mean, I began this by saying that I think these crises that we've seen in the last few months have highlighted and reinforced why local journalism is so important, and that I think that viewers and readers see it too. I could be wrong about that though. So how do we reinforce that? And some of you have already sort of tackled this issue having to do with making sure that we're telling the stories of people whose stories need to be told, making sure that the people that telling the stories, who are telling the stories, are reflective of the communities they cover. But any other thoughts about how we can sort of better make that case and sort of connect those dots?
I think national media could give credit to local orgs more. I think one of the biggest ways that people understand why something is important and where it is coming from is when they read it in the pages of the New York Times, and there is a historical reticence in our industry to generously attribute, even though very many times it is the local news organizations that are significantly less well funded and less well positioned, who are breaking those stories, who are doing the doorstepping, who are there, who are doing the reporting, who are sending the photographers, and who continue to live there after whatever we define as a story is over. But if all you ever see in parentheses, maybe on a good day, is like, you know, initially covered, maybe a hyperlink, and there is no sort of notion of acknowledging where this work is coming from, it makes it harder. You put the onus of all the marketing back on the local news orgs, who generally don't have marketing budgets in the first place.
Tasneem?
Yeah, I would say that some of the most interesting, inspiring work that I am seeing right now is certainly happening. You know, Jeanne, you talked about this idea of review, you know, re-seeing competitors as collaborators. I think that anything we can do to further define and tell the story to our communities of what that means. You know, as journalists, we're often very good at telling the stories of, you know, issues we're covering, sometimes not so good, right? You know, we try to be good at telling the stories of the communities we aim to serve. We're often terrible at telling our own stories. And I think that this is one space where this is parlance that we've gotten very comfortable with, or some of us have gotten very comfortable with, is, oh, collaborations, partnerships. Explain to your community what you're doing. What
that means, yeah.
You know, you know, when we launch our site, we aim to have a how we work category that is like listed alongside the rest of our beats. So what do we cover? We cover arts and community, housing and homelessness, education, equity, city hall and policing, and public health and environmental impacts. And then right alongside of it, how we work. We need to do a really good job there of telling the story of, okay, when we say we're built on a foundation of listening, what the hell does that mean, right? Like that means something to us as to me as a journalist. Well, what does that mean to the public? You know, so I think it's, really reporting on our own work through an accessible, clear lens that is rich in storytelling and rich in inviting people to get involved, and not assuming that other people understand what we're trying to do behind the scenes. You know, start with why, explain why we're doing it, and if we're getting into spaces that feel new and exciting, like collaborations and partnerships, let's make sure our communities understand the work that goes into it and why they might be interested in supporting that work.
Thank you. Jeanne?
I don't have too much to add, Kyle, except I want to do a shout out for professional journalists who are good listeners, make all the difference. And it's all very well and good to sort of talk about different ways of getting the news in. I still think we need professional journalists that understand the pressures and the whole objectivity, fairness, all those concerns in our newsroom, helping before the information gets flooded out, flooding the zone.
Yep.
Farai.
Well, I will do my fifth promotional, like we have a landscape analysis coming out at the end of the month. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully you'll be on some distribution list for it. I think that looking at
storytelling.
Pardon?
You're good at storytelling, exactly. Your own story.
Exactly. Never miss a PR opportunity. But I mean, it's been fascinating doing research while on a moving train of history. We started this research 7 months ago. It was supposed to be published in April. We rebooted for COVID and refocused and did some new interviews. No one knows the future. I think that what we have to do is have values. And to me, you know, being a journalist has been amazing and frustrating and all of the things. But it's, to me, a value proposition around how I communicate with other people and also the truths I tell myself. You know, I have confirmation bias sometimes around certain issues, but I can look in the mirror and say, you're being biased right now. What are you going to do about it? I think that we have to have humility as journalists and funders and newsroom leaders about who we are and what we bring to the table, and look at this as a great adventure that we don't know the ending to.
Emily, you get the last word.
I would just say copy all of the above, and thank you so much to the panel for all of their insights. I just sort of really hope that we can harness this kind of energy and momentum. I mean, the one thing I would say is that maybe we'll have a change of administration in November. We don't know this, as Farai says, nobody knows the future. One thing, and I'll pick up on something that Stacey said and that all the panelists, you know, did thumbs up to, which is all of these, everyone is doing, I think, amazing work in newsrooms at the moment. You know, on this panel, I kind of read all of your work and it's really sort of an extraordinary thing, but I think we also need really big systemic changes. We need big systemic changes from the platforms. We need big systemic changes in how wealth is redistributed from maybe the kind of profit-driven media. And we probably need some changes as well in law. And we need some thoughts about how we might want to make journalism sustainable in the same way that we made journalism sustainable in large parts of the world after the Second World War, by thinking about how you have a system that isn't just left to chance. Because my big worry is that unless we make those big changes, then all the really fantastic things that happen a million times a day that journalists are driving will actually sort of still be driven out, if you like, by the kind of by the forces of not such good things. Sorry, that's a down. I can't finish panels without a down note, but I have to say it's been a great conversation.
Pessimism.
Yes, exactly. But thank you all.
Thank you, Tasneem. Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you, Stacy-Marie. Thank you, Farai. Thanks to everyone who came on to listen. Keep an eye out for the next weekly installment of this conversation with Emily and Tao and myself and CJR, which will be a week from today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kyle.